Welcome. Today, we're diving into an absolutely epic story. It's a story about how a nation was born, forged in the fire of protest. But it's also a story about deep, complicated divisions. We're talking about the birth of modern India. So let me start with a huge question. How do you actually unite a nation, right? It's not just about drawing lines on a map. It's about getting millions of incredibly diverse people to feel a sense of shared identity, a sense of belonging. So how on earth did India even begin to tackle that? Well, our story really kicks off right after 1919. The First World War had just ended, and it left India in a really terrible state. Think about it. Taxes were skyrocketing, prices for everyday goods had pretty much doubled, and forced recruitment into the army had made people in the villages furious. And as if that wasn't enough, crops failed, leading to famine and disease. People were hoping things would get better after the war, but they didn't. All this shared hardship created the perfect storm for a massive nationwide movement. Now, you might think a national identity comes from a shared culture or history, but in this case, the first real sparks of unity didn't come from that. They came from having a shared enemy. The initial sense of we was forged in protest against British policies that people felt were deeply, deeply unfair. And this law, the Rowlatt Act, was just a massive slap in the face to pretty much every Indian. It gave the British government the power to lock up anyone they wanted for up to 2 years without a trial. Just think about that. It was so hated that it brought all sorts of different groups together in opposition. This is what prompted a new leader, Mahatma Gandhi, to call for a nationwide nonviolent protest. And this is where that widespread anger turned into absolute outrage. In the city of Amritsar, a peaceful crowd gathered. Many were just there for a festival. They were trapped in an enclosed garden, and British troops, under the command of General Dyer, just opened fire. His own words were that he wanted to produce a moral effect, basically terror. After this, the government cracked down even harder, with things like forcing Indians to literally crawl on the streets. This one horrific event sent shockwaves across the entire country. So the anger was there, it was boiling over. But how do you channel it? For a mostly unarmed population, just fighting back with violence wasn't really an option. And this is where Mahatma Gandhi stepped in with a totally new, radical idea, a new way to struggle that would literally change the course of history. He called it satyagraha. The word itself means something like truth force. The whole idea was, if your cause is true and just, you don't need to use physical force. You don't seek revenge. Instead, a satyagrahi, or a follower of this path, could win by appealing to the conscience of the oppressor through peaceful, nonviolent resistance. Now, this wasn't passive at all. It was an incredibly active, disciplined, and powerful form of protest. And you can hear it in his own words here. For Gandhi, this was way more than just a political strategy. It was a moral and spiritual belief. He was convinced that this dharma of nonviolence was the only thing powerful enough to actually unite all Indians in their struggle. And here's the crucial part. This wasn't just a theory he came up with. He'd already put it into practice and seen it work. He'd led successful satyagraha campaigns for peasants in Champaran and Kheda, and for cotton mill workers in Ahmedabad. So he had proof that this method could work on a local scale. The big question was, could it work for an entire nation? Okay, so that brings us to the first major attempt to take this idea of satyagraha and scale it up to an all-India level. And it was all built on a very simple but totally revolutionary idea. In his book, Hind Swaraj, Gandhi laid out this incredibly powerful logic. He said, look, how could a few thousand British officials rule hundreds of millions of people? It's only possible because Indians cooperate with them. So the solution is simple. Stop cooperating. If Indians refused to participate, if they boycotted British schools, courts, jobs, and goods, the whole system would just collapse. So the movement launched, and it did so with a really strategic alliance. To bring Hindus and Muslims together, Gandhi took up the Caliphate issue, which was a cause really important to Indian Muslims at the time. The goal was to build a united front, to have everyone together fighting for Swaraj, or self-rule. But then it all came to a screeching halt. In a town called Chaudi Chaura, a protest turned violent and some policemen were killed. For Gandhi, this was a complete disaster. It went against the core principle of satyagraha. He felt that the people just weren't ready for a truly nonviolent struggle, so he called the whole movement off. And as you can imagine, a lot of other nationalists were not happy about that decision. And that sudden stop really exposed a huge crack in the movement. You see, while everyone was chanting the same slogan, Swaraj, it turned out that word didn't mean the same thing to everybody. And this is where that simple idea of a single, united nation starts to get really complicated. Let's just look at this. For a peasant in Awadh, Swaraj wasn't some abstract political idea. It meant an end to crazy high rents and being forced to work for free. For tribal communities in the Gudum Hills, it meant getting their traditional rights to the forests back. And for plantation workers in Assam, Swaraj was something as simple as the freedom to leave the plantation and go back to their home village. Everybody was fighting for freedom, but their vision of what that freedom looked like was rooted in their own, very different daily struggles. All right, so after the non-cooperation movement ended, things went quiet for a few years. But by 1930, the call for full, complete independence was getting louder and louder. The problem was, how do you unite everyone again, from the richest businessman to the poorest farmer, behind one single cause? Gandhi knew he needed to find an issue that could connect that big, abstract idea of freedom to something real, something that affected everyone's daily life. What was one thing that every single person in India could look at and agree was unjust? And the answer he came up with? It was pure genius. Salt. Everybody needs it. Everybody uses it, from rich to poor. And the British government had a total monopoly on it and taxed it. It was a daily, constant reminder of British control. Gandhi called the salt tax the most oppressive face of British rule. It was the perfect symbol. And so one of the most incredible acts of political protest in history began. Gandhi and 78 of his trusted volunteers set out to walk 240 miles to the sea. Just imagine that. It took them 24 days. This whole thing was designed as this epic journey to capture the attention of India and of the entire world. And then the moment came. When he finally reached the coast at Dandi, Gandhi bent down, picked up a handful of salty mud from the ground, and by doing so, he symbolically broke the British salt law. This one simple act of defiance set off a massive wave of civil disobedience all across the country. Thousands and thousands of people started making their own salt, openly challenging the authority of the British Empire. But here's the thing. Even at the absolute peak of this incredible national unity, those deep divisions were still there, right below the surface. The movement was powerful, but it also revealed just how hard it was to build a single nation out of so many different communities, each with their own fears and their own dreams. And this brings us to one of the most critical debates inside the movement itself. You had Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who was a brilliant leader for the Dalits, the so-called untouchables. He argued that they needed separate electorates to guarantee they would have a political voice. But Gandhi was terrified this would shatter Hindu society forever. They had this huge, fundamental disagreement that really exposed the deep wounds of the caste system. They eventually reached a compromise called the Pune Pact, but the tension was very, very real. And at the very same time, a lot of Muslim leaders were getting more and more worried. This quote here from the famous poet and philosopher Muhammad Iqbal kind of sums it up. They feared that in a democracy where Hindus would be the majority, their own culture and identity would just get swallowed up. This led to calls for special protections and really laid the groundwork for the divisions that would come later. And that brings us right back to where we started. The struggle for Indian independence shows us something really profound about what it takes to build a nation. Fighting a common enemy, that might actually be the easy part. The real, lasting challenge is navigating all the struggles within a society. The fights for power, for identity, for justice. And that's a struggle that didn't just end in 1947. In many ways, it's a struggle that continues to shape India to this very day.